Jenny Kwan and Peter Marcus. The federal government has been cutting funding for advocates and social services, such as the Aboriginal Friendship Center. The downtown east side is one of the communities that has been disproportionately affected by those cuts. If elected, what would you do to address these cuts?
I mentioned earlier the infrastructure budget that we have, $6.4 billion a year that we want to see reinvested back into cities and Canadian communities. We've seen government, whether it's in Victoria or in Ottawa, that is suffering from what we call in technical terms regulatory capture, where the entire sole purpose of government in Ottawa and Victoria suddenly becomes to serve oil and gas industries. And it seems all of our public policy, all these things like C-51, all these bills that put forward are entirely focused on that. What we want to do is reinvest in communities because that's where Canadians live. We need to get rid of these subsidies for oil and gas companies that are destroying the environment and put those subsidies into community centers, into art spaces, into things like Aboriginal Front Door, into the Mother Center, into all these things that are making our community healthier, making our community a happier place. So absolutely, we want to see that funding that's been cut to the advocacy organizations is of fundamental importance to communities like the downtown east side. And I want to work in Ottawa to get that money back to where it needs to go, which is Canadian communities that require and rely on those resources.
What we have seen over the last number of years, both the federal government and the provincial government cutting significant funding for organizations, nonprofit organizations, who's doing advocacy work, important work that supports the community and strengthens the community. And in the name of ideology, my belief is that they've cut those funding because they want to silence the community. That is exactly what they're doing. And so yes, we need to fight back and stop that kind of behavior from governments, and then the federal government also needs to ensure that there's funding in place to support the good work of our community. The status of women, for example, they've had funding cuts that I can't even count anymore, how much funding and how deep they've cut it. You know, programs for violence against women is actually being cut across this country. Shelters are now, last year, there are over 300 women in 1 month that they couldn't get a shelter. Women with children. And that's funding cuts all the way through. I can name out all the different sectors. You already know it because you experience in the community, and we've got to stop that at all levels of government and to make sure that we invest in the community, strengthen the community, because what you do, when you succeed, and the good work that you do, makes us all successful. So I will be your strongest advocate there. I came from the nonprofit sector, and I know what it means and how you make the dollar stretch. I know what you do when you fight the good fight. And here in East Van, we have that tradition. When we fight that fight, we affect change not just for us here in this community. We do this across the nation. And we affect change in such a basic and fundamental way that actually turns the world around. And that's what Van East has always been about. And I will be your strongest advocate over there in Ottawa.
Well, they always complain that they don't have enough money. They have a lot of money for warfare. They got a lot of money for the corporations. They got a lot of money for their corporate trade deals that they're going to sell this country down the river. But they don't have any money for things that matter to people. And also they want to privatize everything and hand it over to big corporations. And we call for the reverse of privatization. For example, I was in Children's and Women's Hospital, working there as a transport attendant, and Bill 29 came in. And in 2004, after I retired, thousands of workers were fired and replaced with workers that were paid $8 less. Now look at the housing costs in Vancouver. And these people are going to be marginalized or scrambling for jobs. So this is not going to, this is not just a question of the various advocacy groups. We need to look a lot deeper. This has to do with the nature of capital today. Capitalism today is on an offensive like the likes of which we've never seen. It's corporations that we need to deal with. We need to deal with capital. We need to start taxing them. Yeah, they only pay, I believe it's 15%. And they used to pay a lot higher than that in taxes. We need to tax them and start calling for the funding of the advocacy groups, but also to provide alternatives. What happens when... Okay.
So we're going to move on and go to a section where we're going to give each of the candidates 1 minute each to answer the following questions. And our first question is about adult literacy, because the federal government has made cuts to that, like our learning center upstairs. And so the question is, what are your commitments with regard to adult literacy and skills development? And 1 minute each.
Okay. Part of our program is to invest in social programs. There have been so many cutbacks that they're becoming less and less and less available to people. And it's just incredible that, that we don't have adequate literacy and that they cut it from BCC and other places. So definitely, adult literacy lessons along with other social programs and other educational opportunities should be widely available and fully subsidized by all 3 levels of government, actually. So that goes with all the social programs and the education and the housing, all those social programs and support programs that people really, really need. And but again, we've got to think, what are the economics behind this? And in Ottawa, who is running things? Despite good intentions and being advocates in that, who is really running things? Are they going to let us? Can't have those social programs. We need to fight for it.
I don't think there'd be anybody here that would be opposed to increasing funding for literacy programs. But it's interesting, what has happened to our education system? What's happened to the I'll give an example. I hand out a paper at Broadway in Maine called People's Voice, a communist paper. And occasionally I see people and claim they can't read the paper, can't hand it out. In an advanced capitalist country like Canada, there's illiteracy. This is unbelievable.
40%.
40%
of people in Canada have.
It's unbelievable. Advanced country like this, that nobody should be illiterate. In Cuba, a poor country, everybody.
When the adult literacy program funding was being cut federally and provincially, and when ELL programs, ESL programs, otherwise known as, were being cut both federally and provincially, I was in the provincial legislature fighting against that, raising that issue, bringing students and hearing their stories, attending marches and rallies, writing letters until the cows come home to say no, because every single person deserves the right to succeed. My mom has a grade 6 level of education. My dad has a grade 10 level of education from China. My generation, my brother, my sister, and myself were the first generation to have access to post-secondary education. That opportunity should be offered to everyone, no matter who you are, where you come from. Every level of government needs to step up to the plate and to fund access to education for everyone.
We live in a crazy world, and I feel so fortunate to have access to things like YouTube because it allows me to get my message out to everybody. And learning to read is so important, but there's so many skills out there. And I really feel like if we collect tax and give that money to teachers with the goal of teaching people to read, then we're thinking too narrowly. I would much rather collect taxes and give them to people to see how they see fit to use money. Is it learning to create podcasts? Is it learning to create YouTube videos? Is it learning to read and write or play music? People deserve dignity. And by forcing them into this funnel where they're learning to read through a literacy program, I don't believe we're giving them that. We can do better. Thank you.
When I was living in, I've lived in a lot of different neighborhoods here in East Bend. I lived in Gastown about 15 years ago, roughly, no, maybe about 12, 13 years ago, and I didn't graduate high school, so for me having the adult education center here on Powell or Fort Hope, I believe it is, that was a valuable resource for me in the community back at the time. And so I've seen firsthand, how we need these things to be accessible in our communities. And I don't have a specific answer in terms of the adult literacy program, but I can say that we do call for restored funding for English as a second language, particularly in terms of our immigration program, which needs to be overhauled, or our refugee program, which needs to be overhauled. But programs like the adult literacy program, we see those as a fundamental part of our, as I said earlier, our reinvestment in the community system. All the money that we see going back into community centers, back into learning centers, back into cooking centers, will be a part of that. And I personally, absolutely 100% would like to see funding restored for that. So I would be working in Ottawa to make sure that access to that is made available. We also want to see a switch to universal free tuition for post-secondary for all Canadians. It's time to make education a right, like housing a right. We all need to have a right to read and hear.